Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started here. If everybody would jump in your seats. I've been asked today. My name is Marty Irby, Executive Director of Animal Wellness Action here in Washington, D.C. Lifelong horseman. I've been riding since I can't remember not riding, learning how to ride. Maybe since I was like 2 by myself. And live here on Capitol Hill. I've lived here for about 9 years. Prior to Animal Wellness Action, worked at another group, and before that on Capitol Hill for a Congressman, Ed Whitfield, who represented the western third of Kentucky. And he's retired now, but at the time he was kind of the go-to person on horses in Congress and was a terrific advocate. So I wanted to talk to you guys today in sort of a lobbying 101 theme that can be very informal. I don't have a PowerPoint or do PowerPoints. Glad to answer any questions along the way. You don't have to, we don't have to wait till the end. If you guys, I'm at a place where we're talking about something and you just want to raise your hand and ask a question, I'm glad to answer it. Linda, how much time do I have to?
A little over an hour.
Oh, okay. But plenty of time.
Or until Ty pops in.
Okay, I won't go that long. I don't know if I can talk now, but maybe yes. I guess what I will do is kind of start from the very basics and walk everybody through the various committees, how a bill becomes a law. Many of you may have seen that old cartoon many years ago, I'm Just a Bill. I don't think that many people watch it today, but it's a very intricate process, and I think a lot of people, not you guys here, I know most of you all here are pretty savvy in this department, but most of the average advocates that I talk to broadly, not specific to wild horses, don't know the difference between their state senator and state representative, or their federal senator and federal House member and that sort of thing. So obviously you have a state legislature in every state. Those people represent the state interests, state laws, and they really have very, very little to do with the federal government. They try to stay in their lane. The federal government tries to stay in their lane and out of state legislatures and so on and so forth. So everyone has, of course, 2 U.S. senators from whatever state you're from, unless you're from a U.S. territory or you live here like me in Washington, D.C., and we have no senators. You also have 1 member of the House of Representatives. Every member of Congress in the House of Representatives, on average, represents about 750,000 people. So if you think about that, and you think that a average Hill office on Capitol Hill in the House of Representatives probably has about 8 staff in Washington, D.C., probably about 6 to 8 staff back in their district on the ground that deals with more constituent services. Those people back in the district office, they deal with what we call casework. So if you're trying to get appointed to the Naval Academy, if you're trying to get the IRS to work with you on your tax return, if you have some special incident or circumstance related to your own personal life, your own personal interests, that's what the people back in the district handle, and that's what they deal with typically. There are a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's the general formula. And every office in the House of Representatives and every office in the U.S. Senate has their own office policies. So you have to almost treat them like 535 different little businesses. Yes, they all answer to the leadership in both chambers of Congress. Yes, they have to follow the rules of ethics in the Senate and the House. Yes, they have to follow the law, but as far as office policy, how they handle their constituents, how many times it takes for you to contact them to respond, what their timeline is on that, that's all typically varying from office to office. And I don't think that there's really a broad formula on that. Everybody's a little bit different. Some are really terrible, some are really great, some are in between. So when you're talking with your House members and senators, I think it's very important that you acknowledge how much work you realize they have. We all know that our members of Congress work for us. We pay our taxes. The taxpayer pays them. But I think it does mean a lot to them and to their staff that you recognize and say, hey, we know how busy you guys are. We know that you're dealing with thousands of issues and that you represent 750,000 people if you're talking to a member of the House, and maybe millions of people if you're talking to a senator, depending on what state they're from. I think that's very important because each of these staff members have what they call a legislative portfolio. So when I worked on Capitol Hill, I was a communications director and press secretary, so I did all the comms work, but I had a legislative portfolio that's not typical for comms directors and press secretaries, but because of my background in horses, I did all things agriculture, animal welfare, issues related to the science committee because I just like NASA and space, and sometimes staff get to pick and choose, if they have a degree in engineering and they want to deal with the issues related to the Army Corps of Engineers, that's usually a likely match and that sort of thing. If you're someone who's a lawyer, you might want to deal with the issues related to the Judiciary Committee or the Supreme Court, whatever the case may be. Most of the staff that you're going to meet on Capitol Hill and you're going to be talking to, there's sort of, I think, a general assumption that a lot of people are lawyers, and there are a lot of lawyers on staff, but most of them are probably not lawyers. So we have a lot of people, including myself, lobbyists, advocates who are helping make the laws that aren't lawyers. And I think that's a good thing. When you go into the House of Representatives, you have what we call an authorizing committee, and then you have the appropriations committee. Same thing on the Senate side. And I was going to kind of break down that a little bit and go through the committee process of how a bill is introduced and ultimately becomes a law. So the appropriations committee is one committee, typically has 4 or 5 subcommittees depending on which chamber you're talking about. Usually every area of interest is sort of broken down by department or federal agency. So you have an Interior Appropriations Subcommittee that handles the Department of Interior. You have an Agriculture Appropriations Subcommittee that handles the USDA. You have several others. You have like a Veterans Affairs Subcommittee that might encompass military and veterans issues and that sort of thing. And when you have a bill that is written, we try to get these bills written where they go to the committee that we want them to go. Because a lot of times we know that, hey, if we had an issue related to horse slaughter, let's say, the SAFE Act, the worst thing that you could have happen is for that bill to be referred to the Ag Committee, because typically the members of the Ag Committee are pro-slaughter for the most part. Typically they're in, I'll say, I guess, more in sync than cahoots, but cahoots is probably the better word, with the big agriculture interests. And of course we have those folks like the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, the Farm Bureau, and other groups who are very pro-slaughter and have this slippery slope argument, that if we stop horse slaughter, that we're going to end up stopping the slaughter of pigs and chickens and cows, which I think is a just bogus argument. We dealt with that when we passed a law in 2018 to ban the slaughter of dogs and cats in America, because yes, it was a problem. One of the ways that we got that through was because we attached it to the Farm Bill that was moving through Congress, and I'm going to come back to the Farm Bill. That happens every 6 years. But the messaging in that was what was key. And whether what I'm about to say is popular or not, I'm not saying it to offend anyone. I'm just saying this was the tactic that we used that got the job done. We knew that Republicans were very much interested in the immigration issues, and we started talking to them about the cultures that were bringing eating dogs and cats into the United States. And that appealed to them because they felt, look, oh my gosh, if we ban eating dogs and cats in the US, then maybe all of these people won't come to the US, or maybe it'll stop a few of them from coming. And you wouldn't think that many people would say that, but it worked. And we passed this through the committee. We had the Democrats' support on the front end because the Democrats cared about the animal issues and they cared about stopping the slaughter of cats, but we had to have some way to appeal to this Republican constituency that really wasn't necessarily interested. We got that done and signed into law, and we heard the slippery slope argument, and of course they said horse slaughter is going to be next. The next thing I said, well, number one, we're already trying to stop horse slaughter, so it's not next. It just may be the next thing that gets done. But it's important to realize that you sometimes have to make an argument that may not necessarily be about the animals and animal welfare. What we were talking about earlier with Congressman Cohen, I know so many of you mentioned the fiscal spending, the billions of dollars it's going to cost. William Perry Penley, the last director of the BLM, said it's going to cost $5 billion, his words, over 15 years to deal with the wild horse problem, although we know it's not a problem. That's what he said. That's what he estimated the cost would be. So it's good that we have those hard facts and that we have wild horses on the range right now that we know are not costing anything really, very, very little, if anything, and we're absorbing this huge cost and expense, the taxpayer subsidizing cattle ranchers. That's the argument that appeals to Republicans on this particular issue. Like I said, the Democrats are typically great on animal issues, but I do think that that also appeals to them because a lot of them aren't necessarily interested in the spending as much as they are the subsidy and anti-competitive business practices. And that's an important thing to keep in mind with this as well. So when a bill gets introduced, as I said earlier, it gets referred to X committee. and that, I guess in the instance of the SAFE Act, it has in the past been referred to both the Ag Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee. I believe in this Congress, for whatever reason, it was not referred to the Ag Committee, only to the House Energy and Commerce Committee, but it's because of the way that it was written. It was specifically written to go to the Health Subcommittee and deal with the food safety aspect of horse slaughter, that, we have horses that are not raised for food. They're typically given drugs that are not good for humans. They can cause death, disease, different things if humans consume horse meat. So that's why that was sent to that committee, and to make it easier for us in the long run to hopefully get the bill passed. The Senate bill on the SAFE Act was referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was written intentionally to go to the Judiciary Committee, because at the time that it was rewritten for that in the previous Congress, Senator Lindsey Graham was the chairman of the committee, and he was one of the leaders of the bill. Unfortunately, even though it was written to go to his committee and he was the leader of the bill, they still didn't do anything. But that was because of the interest of other members of the committee, like Chuck Grassley from Iowa, who's a huge big ag guy, a very pro-slaughter guy, that was the previous chairman and is now the chairman again in this session. So you have to keep in mind, even when you have the leader of a bill, and the leader of the bill could be the chairman of the committee of jurisdiction, same thing with Chairman Grijalva over on the House side, you still may not get any action. And I hate to say that and be the bearer of bad news, but it's a reality that we face. Politics, of course. And so a wild horse bill, we're going to talk about a little further into this. There are several bills. I know there's one already out there that Congresswoman Dina Titus has introduced. There are two more that are going to be introduced. They're going to typically be referred to the House Natural Resources Committee, because that's what deals with the Department of Interior. Fortunately, we have a great champion in Chairman Raul Grijalva, who's a Democrat from Arizona. He's been with Congressman Cohen on all of these issues. When we ran the $11 million amendment back in 2019, he was one of the original co-sponsors with Cohen and Titus and others. I think he signed every letter to the secretary dealing with the wild horses back when Secretary Holland was actually a chair of a subcommittee under his committee. She was with us signing these letters to the Department of Interior, and has subsequently changed her position. But it's important to remember that these committees, they really control things. It's not necessarily that Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell is stopping something or preventing something from coming to the floor, because for the most part, they probably don't know much or anything about it. They look to these committee chairs and the ranking members of the committee, so that the majority party in whatever chamber, right now Democrats in both chambers, have the chairman, and the ranking member is the opposite party that's in the minority. So you have Raul Grijalva on the House side with Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, who's the Republican, and the Republican leadership is going to look toward Bruce Westerman on this issue, and the Democrats are going to look to Mr. Grijalva. Mr. Grijalva has been a tireless champion and advocate, but he's not a very vocal person. And I think, one reason that we haven't seen as much action is because of some of this that we heard from Congressman Cohen about private conversations where the secretary didn't even really want to talk about it. So I know a lot of people are frustrated over that, but I think it's good that we heard that today, as discouraging as it might be, that it's not just us. It's not just you guys. I mean, they're saying the same thing or not saying anything to the members of Congress themselves, which is something that needs to be changed, and in time I think will, as the administration changes and new secretaries come in and different members of Congress come in, that sort of thing. So that authorizing committee is who everyone looks to, who really has the power and control. They can bring a bill up in the subcommittee of jurisdiction for a hearing. They may not bring a bill up ever. They then have to bring them up in the full committee, and there's a process I'm going to get to in a minute on that. There's also the Appropriations Committee. As I said, they are strictly related to funding the federal government. And there's a huge, I think, misunderstanding with the general public that you can do certain things in appropriations that you cannot. The common term around this place that most people use is, the no-no is legislating on approps, is what they call it, which we have actually done. And they pick and choose when they want to do it, but their general rule of thumb is that they don't do it. The only time I've really been able to get something done that was major in appropriations was the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Act. And you can look at the year-end omnibus, and at the end of it, there's this giant long horse bill, and we got a lot of flack from other members of Congress about that. But we had Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy and all the rest of them, all 100% in agreement, both chambers, both sides of the aisle. So the appropriators in that instance said, okay, well, the leadership wants this, we're going to do it. But they definitely did push back in that instance. So that's the difference between an authorizing committee and an appropriations committee, and the difference in what their actual roles are and what they actually do. So appropriations specific to funding the federal government, the authorizing committee, the full House Natural Resources Committee, the Senate EPW committee is the counterpart, or what they call the analog, even though because they don't have the same names in each chambers, the committees. And they really have to say so over whether a bill gets any action or not. And so that bill, if all goes well and everything goes through the process the right way, and you have the best situation that you can possibly think of for any legislation, when that bill gets introduced to that, it gets referred to that full committee. The full committee chair later refers it to the subcommittee. In the instance of wild horses, it would be under there's a subcommittee. It's a national park subcommittee, basically an interior underneath the Natural Resources Committee, and that is where the bill ends up landing. That's I guess the bottom level is what you would call it. The process for actually taking that bill, making it a law in both chambers is the same. They have what they call regular order, and that's the process that if you actually follow what the founders of this country intended and you go through the process of regular order, that's the right way to do things. Now, the Congress and the Senate and the House have both changed the rules as time goes on. They have completely different rules in each chamber, and so, give me a second. They have completely different rules in each chamber, and they pick and choose when they want to go by regular order or not. I will say, fortunately, in this Congress and the previous Congress, Nancy Pelosi is very, very good about sticking to regular order. The Senate, not so much under Republicans or Democrats. And so the first step after that bill has gone to the subcommittee referral is that it would have a hearing in the subcommittee. I've testified in 2 subcommittee hearings on horses, one in 2013, one in 2020 here, and it's probably once a Congress or so that we get some sort of a hearing related to horses, not necessarily wild horses. It might be the SAFE Act, it might be horse soaring, it might be horse racing, it might be the wild horses. We really haven't had anything in this Congress yet. Part of that is because of the COVID shutdown and all of that sort of thing. It's not specific to the horses, there's just been fewer hearings and that sort of thing. So after you have a hearing in the subcommittee of jurisdiction, the next step would be to have what they call a markup, and it is exactly what it sounds like. You take the bill, you mark it up, you redline it, you change this language, insert different language. You might, in the instance of an amendment we did with Congressman Cohen and others back last year on horse slaughter transport, this was completely my fault. I used the word horses, and everybody went crazy because I didn't use equines or equids because I left out the burros, and it was my fault, and it was an oversight. But in what we call a markup, and that actually went through sort of a markup, we ended up changing it by the time we got it to the floor, and we got it passed through the House of Representatives. So there are steps along the way that are there to correct errors, because we all make errors. Legislative Council makes errors, members of Congress makes errors, I make errors. Every staff member that I know in Congress has made an error of some kind at some point. So when you have that markup, it's almost like a second hearing. They go through, typically the sponsor of the bill or the committee chair or the ranking member will offer whatever amendments to that bill that they want to offer in the subcommittee markup, make those changes. The subcommittee will then vote. For the most part, unfortunately, they typically vote along party lines. So in this Congress, if you're in the House and you have all the Democrats vote for something and none of the Republicans, it's still going to pass. And if you have all the Republicans vote for something and the Democrats don't, then it's not going to pass. In the Senate, it's a little bit different because they're at a stage where they have 50-50 split. So just about every committee has the same ratio based on the majority of the chamber. So let's just say there are 10 members on the, I don't know that that's the number, but let's say there are 10 members on the Senate EPW committee of jurisdiction. If we have something that we want to run in a committee markup, then we have to have at least one person from the other party vote with the party that is typically voting along party lines. So if we have something that the Democrats want in the Senate to get it through the committee during this Congress, because of the way that it's laid out, 50-50, we've got to get at least one Republican to vote with the Democrats, and we can't lose the Democrat in committee, otherwise it's going to fail. So a few weeks ago, they were working on a bill that was passing through the Senate EPW committee that deals with hunting and some of the wildlife things, and we were trying to get the Big Cat Public Safety Act included, and another bill to do with minks included, and at the end of the day, we could not get the Republican votes, so we pulled the amendments because if you have a 10-10 vote, it fails, does not pass. So we didn't want that on the record, and we ultimately decided not to do it. Sometimes you can roll the dice and win, and I think that's more of a gut instinct thing, and just sort of knowing the lay of the land and who may be there, who may speak out in opposition and that sort of thing. Once you get through that subcommittee markup, and that bill has been passed out of the subcommittee, then it goes to the full committee. And the full committee with like Chairman Grijalva on the House side, for an example, and Mr. Westerman, who's the ranking member, will get together and they'll typically agree about what bills they want to bring up in the full committee. They look to the subcommittee chairs and the subcommittee ranking members that have passed them, and they ask them, hey, how important is this to you guys? Is it important to your state, your constituency, whatever the case may be, and make their determinations from there. I think that they have been pretty good in this Congress about bringing things up, whether they support them or not, because they know that they have a situation where even if they bring up something they don't like, that the other party does like, they can probably vote it down the way that things are split right now. So that has happened a lot in this Congress, a lot more than usual, I would say. And once you have that then markup in the full committee, you could actually have a hearing stage, a second hearing in the full committee, and then a markup, but these days that doesn't happen very often because they just won't take the time once they just want that first hearing on the record so that the full committee can just go back and watch the hearing that they had in the subcommittee. And then they do the full committee markup and make whatever changes they want to make further to the bill. So this is the second opportunity where you have to basically edit a bill and make changes, correct errors. Sometimes I know I've dealt with bills where they were specific to breeds and they didn't capitalize the first letter of the breed, and there are repercussions that could occur because it's not capitalized as a racking horse, let's say, because there are some horses that are not racking horses that rack. So there's some potential consequences with that sort of thing. They make those changes. We actually did that one time in 2014 in the Senate, that specific example with a bill having the letter that way. And then they pass them, vote, pass them out of committee, or it fails. If it passes out of committee and the chairman has, said it's out of our hands, it goes to the leadership. It doesn't really go to the speaker in the House. It goes to the majority leader and the minority leader, and the decision is up to them. In this Congress, those two people. No, you're good. I'm good. In this instance, those two people on the Democrat side are Steny Hoyer from Maryland, a great animal advocate, good friend of ours, tireless champion, and then Kevin McCarthy from California, who is not so much an animal champion, and hasn't been very helpful for the most part over the past 10 years. Those people determine what goes to the House floor. For the most part, the majority party, when you get to that stage in the leadership and you're out of the committee jurisdiction and deciding, the majority party sets the schedule and sets the agenda. There may be some instances where they take up bills led by members of the minority party, but they're typically like warm and fuzzy bills that just have no opposition, or at least they know 75% of the House supports it. And those type of bills are called what we say, or what's known as the suspension calendar. So if you ever hear someone talk about bringing a bill to a vote on suspension, the suspension calendar is where that bill has left the committee, it goes to the leadership sit down together and they say, okay, what do these bills have in the way of co-sponsors? And this is where co-sponsors are important. Co-sponsors can be a little bit of a racket, honestly, because I've passed bills with 50 co-sponsors and haven't passed bills with 310 co-sponsors. But the reason that they started the whole thing with co-sponsors was because of the suspension calendar, because under the suspension of the rules, the House suspends their own rules and says the normal rules don't apply. We don't have to go regular order. These bills are non-controversial. They have suspension votes once a week, usually the day that they fly into town. So today's Wednesday. They did this last night on Tuesday because they flew in on Tuesday. They have to have 2/3 of the chamber vote for the bill for it to be able to pass. So it's not like, a majority by one. It's 2/3 of the chamber. In this Congress, that would be roughly 290 people, and that's the magic number around here. So that means it's going to pass typically by a voice vote. They may call for a roll call vote, but if you have 290 in the House, you're going to pass the bill. For a long, long time, there were so many bills that people would get, and they would have 300 co-sponsors, and the committee wouldn't do anything, and the House wouldn't take them up under suspension because the committee wouldn't do anything, and people complained right and left. I mean, we had at one point, I think 5 bills with 290 co-sponsors or more at one time, and couldn't get any of them to a vote. So when the Democrats took the House back in 2019, they took it back in the fall the year before, but they came in as the new Congress in 2019. The Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of legislators in the House that try to work through and find solutions to move these type of bills that we're talking about, came up with a new proposed rule, and they basically said to their leadership, Nancy Pelosi on the Democrat side and Kevin McCarthy on the Republican side, if you want our vote to vote for you for Speaker and for you for Minority Leader, then we want this rule implemented. And that's the trade-off. And what this rule says is that any bill that has 290 co-sponsors, once they hit 290, you have the opportunity to file for what you call putting the bill on the consensus calendar. And the consensus calendar was a new thing, meaning we have a consensus of 2/3 of the House that was first implemented in 2019. It made things a little more difficult to reach 290 after the first few bills that we passed, but we were able to get 2 bills passed in 2019, averting the committee and going straight to the House floor because we had the 290 co-sponsors. Once those bills get 290, the lead sponsor, files the paperwork with the Speaker's office. However many bills there are that have 290 co-sponsors during that month go to the consensus calendar, and then the Speaker of the House only has to pick 1 bill per month to bring to a vote. So I'm just explaining the difficulties and the intricacies of this. And if I'm getting ahead or it's getting too complicated, please tell me. I'm glad that I take for granted sometimes I probably understand it more than some people. But anyway, so then the Speaker only has to pick 1 bill and move that bill to a vote. When this new rule came into play and we knew it was probably going to happen, we have another bill that we work on called the PAST Act to end soring of Tennessee walking horses. I looked at it 2 months before the Congress started. I knew we had 290 in Congresses before, and I think we had 270. So I broke my neck to go out and make sure we hit 290 in the Congress right before December, so that we could show the leadership going into this new rule, here's a bill already that you guys have supported, that Steny Hoyer has actually co-sponsored. The leadership rarely ever co-sponsors a bill, and in this instance, he had co-sponsored it in every Congress. And they sat down with me and they said, we want to make this the first bill to go to the consensus calendar. And I was elated, very surprised to hear that. But we had, fortunately, some connections through the late Senator Joe Tidings, who authored the Horse Protection Act of 1970. It was very close friends with the family of Mrs. Pelosi and Mr. Hoyer. And it was an instance where we renamed the bill after Senator Tidings, the U.S. Senator Joseph Tidings Memorial PAST Act, and created a plan and a pathway and a strategy forward. Unfortunately, we weren't the first bill to hit 290. We were the second. There was another bill that dealt with something, whatever the Cadillac tax is. And they hit 290 2 or 3 days before us. So we were a little worried, oh my gosh, now that's going to be the one bill they picked this month, right? They, fortunately, because of our strategy and the plan that we had, they went ahead. It doesn't say they can't pick more than 1 bill. It says they only have to pick 1 bill. They went ahead and took both bills, brought them to the House floor. The other bill passed, whatever the Cadillac tax bill was, and then the PAST Act passed by a vote of 333 to 96. We got it through that chamber. It was dead on arrival in the Senate, but that was a very intricate process, probably the most complicated thing that I've ever been involved with getting done on Capitol Hill and passed, and it was a lot of work. Getting 290 co-sponsors is, and especially when you get to 250, like that last 40 or 50 is grueling to get. But it can be done. A month later, we hit or maybe 2 months later, we hit 290 on the PACT Act, Preventing Animal Cruelty and Torture Act, and it had previously passed the Senate in 2 Congresses by unanimous consent, had never passed the House because one person was blocking it. In that instance, we hit 290. They went ahead, and it was the only bill that month that had hit 290 and could be brought to the floor on the consensus calendar. So they brought it to the floor, voted on it, and we ultimately passed it to the Senate, got that one signed into law. But in both of those instances, we averted the committee. And the issue with these committees is sometimes that there is a powerful subcommittee chair or ranking member or the vice chair of the committee, maybe the committee chair themselves, that either is opposed to the bill and has some problem with it and doesn't want to touch it or go anywhere near it, even with changes or a markup. In this particular instance, that wasn't the case. It was just that climate change was number one. The Energy and Commerce Committee pretty much handles everything to do with climate change, and this was a low priority. So right when we hit 290, somewhere around, I think we ended up getting 308 co-sponsors, but right after we hit 290, the committee chair, Frank Pallone of Energy and Commerce, he co-sponsored the bill, and that was a good signal to the leadership to say, hey, look, the committee chair's good with it, he just didn't have time to get to it. That's all it was. So we're gonna move this bill and we're gonna pass it. So that's the process on the House side. The Senate does not really have what the equivalent of a suspension calendar would be. It's much, much more difficult to get a bill passed in the Senate. There are really only 2 or maybe 3 ways that you can get a bill passed in the Senate. First is by doing an amendment to any bill that's moving through, like it's the Farm Bill or the FDA reauthorization bill they have every 5 years. Something that they know that they have to pass and it has to get done, or the government's going to shut down, or they're going to have to lay off or furlough 1,000 employees, whatever the case may be. So the easiest way to get something passed in Congress, not that it's ever easy, is to do an amendment to a bill that's already moving that is what they call germane to the issue. So it means, you can't go tack a wild horse amendment onto a bill that deals with trucking or something like that. You probably could finagle a way to tack something on if it were climate change related and under natural resources, but it would have to be something that was moving that had already been through the same committee of jurisdiction that the bill that you want to pass had been referred to. So in the past, let's say 4 years, I can give you 7 or 8 examples of bills we've passed. In the 2018 Farm Bill, we got 3 bills included. One was done as a committee amendment, the dog meat thing I mentioned earlier. One was included in an underlying bill in one chamber, but not in the other, the Pet and Women's Safety Act. So we had to do an amendment in the other chamber. It was in the base bill in one, amendment in the other chamber. One had to do with outlawing animal fighting in the U.S. territories. That bill, we actually had to run an amendment in both chambers because it wasn't in either bill. We ran an amendment on the House side, passed on a recorded vote with probably close to 2/3, something along, maybe 60%. And then on the Senate side, since they don't have as many House members that can offer amendments, and they have, I'll get into the rules in a minute, a little different process, they do what they call a manager's amendment. So if there are amendments that come up for a bill that's moving through the Senate floor, they have an amendment, a broad amendment that could be as many as 20 or 30 or 40 bills that they tack onto this other bill and consider it a non-controversial amendment. Usually the committee chair and the ranking member have to agree, the Republican and the Democrat have to agree, and they say, we're just gonna put it in there, and it's in the bill. We're not even gonna have to go through this amendment process. And I've had amendments get in that way, I've had amendments fail, I've had amendments pass. One that we did get done that way was the animal fighting provision in the Farm Bill of 2018. We had another amendment that was one of 3 that got through to the Senate floor for a vote that would have dealt with the USDA's checkoff programs. That actually failed by like a 60-40 vote. And we were very fortunate to even get it through. But on the House side, they have what they call the Rules Committee, very engaged. They make the decision of whether an amendment gets to the floor for a vote and whether it's considered germane or not. By consulting the parliamentarian. There's a parliamentarian in each chamber that basically decides what the rules are and how they apply. And so there's a variety of different aspects of this thing. And the House Rules Committee is critical. You don't get an amendment done in the House without the Rules Committee. The Senate Rules Committee is Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer, and they make the rules up as they go along, and they do whatever they want to. And there are no rules. And I hate to say that, but that's just the way it is. And when Mitch McConnell was in charge, it was that way, and now that Chuck's in charge, it's that way too. So they pick and choose what they want, and you have to have a lot of political influence to get something past both of them. Because if one of them opposed it, either one, you're not going to probably get it done under this process that we're talking about now. So when a rule is utilized to bring an amendment up in the House, you can bet on it. You can bet on if you check the boxes and done your homework, you're going to probably get it through. In the Senate, you're rolling the dice with whatever political capital that you have to get a vote on that particular amendment or not. Aside from the suspension calendar on the House and the regular process of amending things in the House and Senate that I'm talking about, you can also pass a bill in the Senate by what they call UC, or unanimous consent. Just means that 100 senators have to all agree. They do what they call a hotline. And the process of a hotline is they send out an email to all 100 senators from whoever the lead sponsor of the bill is, and they say, we want to pass this bill. Does anybody have any opposition to it? I've actually only passed one bill that way through the Senate. We passed it through 3 different Congresses, the PACT Act, through the Senate, and it had been tweaked along the way to satisfy everybody's concerns. If there is even one senator that does not agree with that legislation, then they put a hold on the bill, and that will prevent it from passing by unanimous consent. They can release the hold or they can maintain the hold. So if you know that you have a bill and you're, let's just say, Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, and you have a bill that you want a hotline, and you find out that there are 3 people who put a hold on the bill. There are 3 likely suspects that always put a hold on the bill: Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, and Mike Lee. And they're known for that. And they actually read every bill, is why. Because a lot of people don't read bills and don't know what they're passing or voting on, but those 3 actually do read every single bill. And a lot of times they'll read the bill and they'll take the hold off and they're good and they'll pass it. Other times they may read the bill and they may say, no, we're not going to take the hold off. And those 3 usually stick together. There's not really a faction of Democrats similar to those 3, I wouldn't say, on the Senate side, but you've got to have them to be able to get something passed by unanimous consent. So like I said, that's the most difficult way to pass a bill in the Senate. There's another process that is rarely used in the Senate. I've actually never passed a bill this way, but we're about to try something. It's called what they call a live UC, or live unanimous consent. And that's where the senator actually goes down, takes their bill, the physical bill, printed out, and goes down to the Senate floor, has their floor time, and they speak and they say, I'm calling for a live unanimous consent right now here on this Senate floor. And if someone opposes, you have to be there, or you have to run to the Senate floor and be able to speak against it. So if you're smart and you know where everybody is, there is a way that you can sometimes get things done by being at the right place in the right time and others not being at the right place in the right time. Like I said, it rarely happens. We're going to try it with a bill that's called the Bear Poaching Elimination Act that Senator Kennedy actually does have, and we'll see if it works or not. But it's rare, maybe happens 3, 4 times at Congress even, total in the Senate. But it's a sort of a backdoor way, I guess you would say, of getting things done around this place. And it might be, that sometimes the Senate has these, nights of 6 or 8 hours until 3 or 4 in the morning when some are asleep in their office, some might have gone back to their apartment, and one guy might be down on the floor at 2 a.m. and if we're lucky and he's there and, nobody runs down, then we pass it. And you still got to get it back through the House if it hasn't already been through the House, and that's another story. Then there are a lot of instances where you have a bill that may pass the House and you have a bill that may pass the Senate, and if they are not 100% alike, every word, every letter, doesn't matter if it's the title, if a letter is capitalized or not capitalized, if they are not 100% alike, they cannot be signed into law. So the bill has to be passed through both chambers, identical. So let's say probably 7 out of 10 times, they pass the bill in the House, they send it over to the Senate passes a different bill, they don't match, they send it back to the House. They have a stalemate on many occasions. We saw that for a while with the infrastructure bill that finally got passed. We saw that with the Build Back Better that they called it, that didn't pass, and it was for that reason, because the House passed one, the Senate passed one, they were different, they couldn't agree. They used to do what they call a conference committee And until this month, they have not done one since the 1990s, I was told by one member. And they actually have a conference committee on the America Competes Act, which is the China bill that deals with trade with China, because both chambers actually want to do something. It's not just a messaging war. They want to pass a bill and they want to work out the differences. We had a provision in that bill that we didn't have an opportunity to attempt it in the Senate, but we did in the House, and it would ban mink farming in the U.S. because mink are the #1 super spreader of COVID besides humans. And so it's in one bill, but it's not in the other bill. The leadership names conferees, and I think in this instance, it's probably about 50 members of the 535 members. It's typically your committee chairs, your subcommittee chairs, and ranking members, people who have some sort of interest if it's directly related to their state, whatever the case may be. Could sometimes just be political, that people wanted to put somebody on there because they know they're loud and obnoxious and they'll, push people one way or the other. In this instance, this conference and these conferees will be meeting over this month and the next month on into about the first part of June, and they'll be working out the differences between the two bills. The conferees will come back with some product, whatever it is, a final bill, and they'll say to the leadership in both chambers, this is what we all agreed on, and the leadership in both chambers, without fail, will pass it and will say we'll do it because they've gotten that many members of Congress to hash it all out, and they're the ones that have the jurisdiction, and that's how you can pass a bill under conference. They do that a lot with huge pieces of legislation, even if it's not what I'm talking about is a formal conference or formal conferees. They have done like informal conferees and things like that to work out the differences. And then usually it's a vote where they'll take it through one chamber first, it may not be the House and it may not be the Senate. It's just different from bill to bill. And then the opposite chamber will just do what they call a vote to concur. So let's say the Senate passes this bill after it comes out of conference and they send it back over to the House. All the House has to do is they just vote to agree with the Senate. That's all you do. And then it goes to the president's desk, and then hoping that the president doesn't veto the bill, which most times they don't. It's a rare occasion that you have an actual veto. Then the president signs the bill into law, and that's the general process with a lot of intricacies on how you can or can't get a bill done. I hope that was helpful. And glad to talk through some more of lobbying and different things like that, but I wanted to go through process first because so many people don't really understand process or know process, and whatever else you guys want to ask me about that now's the time on the process anyway. Yeah, Greta?
In the 116th Congress, Energy and Commerce Subcommittee had a hearing on the SAFE Act, where the former president of AVMA and Nancy Perry testified. What part of the process was that part of the process, or was that something?
That was part of the process. That was a regular hearing in the subcommittee. So the subcommittee was, it's called DCCP, Digital Commerce and Consumer Protection Subcommittee, chaired by Jan Schakowsky. We had a hearing on the horse racing bill the day before. They moved the horse racing bill forward to a vote, and the SAFE Act died right there.
Yes.
And it died there because Morgan Griffith from Virginia was very outspoken about horse slaughter, very pro-slaughter. Yep. The ag interests were very pro-slaughter, and they heard a lot from the big ag folks. And to them, it was considered controversial, and they dropped it right then.
So the testimony that the AVMA former president, he had strong testimony based on extremely old data, but was a strong speaker. Nancy Perry, didn't go well. Say the least. Anyway. Was that why it died there? Because the testimony that those two gave?
I think that's a big part of it. I was wrong. It was the health subcommittee under ENC, not the one was under, one wasn't. It was the health subcommittee. Yes. After having seen that, I don't know this to be fact, my opinion of it after listening to them, I think that we got our ass kicked. Honestly,
yeah, we did.
In the hearing.
Totally,
and it died right there. And they had heard a lot from Big Ag. So the key was the witness.
I was going to say right now, the fact that we have a few months left and the bills for the House and Senate are different on the SAFE Act. That pretty much dooms this round. We should be priming them to go in next time, get it introduced early enough where we could maybe carry it forward.
Absolutely. And I said something in an article not long ago that I think made a lot of people mad about when I said the SAFE Act is not gonna go anywhere in this Congress. I just try to tell everybody the truth. I don't wanna lead you on. Other organizations wanna fundraise and lead you on and so on and so forth. But what Linda just said is the main reason why the SAFE Act will not pass in this Congress. It's completely different, and you'd have to go through so many processes and so many changes. So hopefully in the next Congress, we can get one bill introduced that's identical, and that's the way to get something done. Cynthia?
Marty, how do they decide who is going to testify in these subcommittees? Who invites whom, and how does that happen?
Usually the committee chair and the ranking member and the lead sponsor of the bill decide. So in the instance of the SAFE Act, Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky is the lead sponsor. She is the one, I know she's the one that made that decision. I know why she made that decision, and quite honestly, you know, the hearing the week before or day before on the horse racing bill, I testified at. The Humane Society had somebody there, and ASPCA didn't get to, and so they got to testify on the SAFE Act, and I think it was more like spreading things around, honestly, than anything. And I love Congresswoman Schakowsky. She's aside from Steve Cohen and Dina Titus, she's one of the top people on horses and issues, but I think in a lot of instances that happens, that people try to, you know, spread things around so that it's not one organization or group dominating. And then they each have a certain number of witnesses. I would say the panels I've been on had 7 each. You always have an odd number. You typically have 4 for a bill and 3 against the bill, no matter what party's doing it. I mean, because if you are going to use the time, you only have so much time in Congress, and that's a key part of all of this, the time in the committee, the time in the Congress, the time on the calendar, the time on the floor. Then you want to make sure that you have speakers who are typically in support of something, and that you're going to, you know, get it through committee. You don't want it to die in committee. In that particular instance, it was a committee hearing where there were a bunch of bills that were heard all at once, and so they didn't have the larger number of people. I think it was just like 2 or 3 that they had testify about that. That happens sometimes too, but typically if you have a committee hearing, subcommittee or full committee dedicated to one issue and not a plethora of bills, it's 7 people, 4, 3 against. So
How do you influence who they select for, or can you influence who they select? I mean, it would be great whether it's wild horses, SAFE Act, doesn't matter to me, but if they're going to pass something based on facts and reality, then they need to call on subject matter experts.
right.
Correct.
I think probably
subject matter experts.
Yeah, the 2 instances, just from my experience, in the 2 instances I testified before, the first time was in support of the PAST Act in 2013. In that instance, Congressman Ed Whitfield was the lead sponsor of the bill, so the sponsor got to pick a certain number of witnesses. The committee and subcommittee chairs got to pick a certain number of witnesses. In that particular instance, Congressman Whitfield asked me to if I would be willing to testify after we had talked on the phone, just because at the time I was very steeped in the issue, and it was a matter of like expert witness type thing. When I testified on the horse racing hearing, I probably mentioned it to Congresswoman Schakowsky. I was her witness in that particular instance at least 5 or 6 times before the hearing. I went after it in the beginning, and she knew we were the ones leading the bill, and it wasn't the other groups and that sort of thing. So there's nothing wrong with pushing members of Congress to get the right witnesses in there. That's what we want. Okay. But you have to ask, and if you don't ask, you can't expect someone just to call you up and ask you to testify. So it's completely kosher, completely legal. Great if you can push to help get the right witnesses in there, and that is very, very important. It'll make or break a bill. And then, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
I was just watching the time here because I got confirmation that Titus is going to be calling in at 3 o'clock. So could you go over a little bit and just explain to everybody the impact of actually calling your legislators and handwriting a letter versus maybe just doing an email, and also the importance of perhaps having more than one person on the call, and having multiple people call in one day or one week on a certain subject also gives credibility to what you're talking to them about.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I would say, you know, times are different these days because of COVID, and the offices have been closed. So what I say today may not be what I would have said 3 years ago, and it may not be what I say a year from now. But today, as we sit with, you know, the chambers kind of loosely open, I think personally the best way to contact your member of Congress first is to write a personalized letter on some sort of letterhead if you represent a group, or it may just be personal stationery, fine, whatever. Make a PDF, find out who the actual staff person is. You can call their office, you can ask them who the staff person is, they will generally tell you. If you don't know or you want to know, I can get it for you. I have a list of, and I've given it to Linda and Britta if you need to know who that person is in each office. Send them that handwritten letter as an attachment with just a short email, and address the letter to the member of Congress, Senator Chuck Schumer, U.S. Senate Majority Leader, at his office address and whatnot. I think that personalization, especially if it's from an organization that you may represent or be a part of, gives a lot of credibility. But I think also once you've sent that, then call back with a follow-up phone call and say, this is so-and-so, I sent a letter in. I would wait a week. If that's what I would do, I'd wait 7 days if it's a weekday and do it the next week. I sent this in last week, just want to make sure that you saw it, so on and so forth. And if you have any questions or not, most of the time they're not going to connect you directly to the person because they may be in a meeting or whatever, but they will take a message, they will get it to them. And I think most offices are pretty good about calling back. It has been a lot more difficult in the past 2 years because of COVID, and they were working from home and remotely, and a lot of the member offices just have a recording when you go on now. So, that personalized letter and that call second. And then I think third is just an email through their website. And that's probably the least important, quite honestly, because they have a couple of different types of systems and programs they use. One that I used is called iConstituent back when I worked on the Hill. And all of those emails from everybody's website that's not sent to a direct email address like a regular email, it's like through a contact form, goes into either IQ or iConstituent, whatever the office has, and it's measured issue by issue. So I remember I used to get all these letters about Nosy the elephant, and you could go in and Nosy the elephant would be a category, and the computer system would literally move your email to like a column of yes or no, we support this or we're against this. Obviously in an instance of animal cruelty issues, I think it's probably overwhelmingly in support of whatever the legislation is, and a minority that's always against it. But they do measure that. They do look at it when it comes to co-sponsoring a bill. They do look at that when it comes to their actual vote. So it's important to have it on the record, because the member of Congress may not see it as your name as an individual, and they may see it as a number, but if there's 70 people for a bill and 65 against it, that can make a difference. So send a personalized letter first, second, call and follow up with that, third, send in an email through their contact form on their website. That help?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was more for everybody else, but
Yep.
yeah.
Go ahead.
What about, I'm sorry, so what about, I think everybody, you're constantly being asked to please sign this petition, and then you just become a number on a petition or a name on a petition. Do they look at those?
Some, yes. Some, no. I would say the only petitions that I know that actually send the messages into Congress is CARE 2. And CARE 2 petitions are, you can start one yourself, but there's also a racket behind it too. I mean, I'll be honest with you, petitions are effective. And just like the one Linda and I took to the Department of Interior, 90,000 people signed. It's definitely worth doing. Definitely an example to show where, the secretary didn't respond, or favorably anyway, after we'd done that. But a lot of people, I think that when they sign a petition, that there's a message that automatically goes to Deb Haaland or automatically goes to whatever member of Congress, and that's not the case. Had Linda not, talked to the Department of Interior and we had not gone and physically carried it, they wouldn't have known or would have never gotten it. So you have to have somebody on the other end to do that. CARE 2 petitions, they do actually have the message go into the members of Congress, and they show up as what Hill staff will call a campaign. So the way they see it is, 100 people, 500 people, 5,000 people, whatever the number is, have the same message. So they understand that's a petition. And it goes into that system that I was just talking about where column A, column B. But as far as I know, only CARE 2 petitions are the one that do that. Now what CARE 2 does is they sell your names on the back end for $1.23 a piece. And every time you sign on, they're making $1.23 and selling it to somebody because I buy their names. So that's why I know. So, and you can't, like if you start a CARE 2 petition, typically as far as I know, I haven't been able to, unless something's changed, go in and actually get all the email addresses yourself. So they turn around and sell those emails to the whoever's trying to find someone. Let me went right over here.
Okay, in my interactions with legislators, I always talk about how wild horse and borough issues are nonpartisan because it's pretty much equal on both sides of the aisle as far as advocacy. But now we have the other issue where we are tying wild horses on the range into climate change and public lands, and that's not a partisan issue. How do we navigate that?
That's a very good question, actually. I think for the most part, animal issues should be nonpartisan,
Right.
are nonpartisan, or call them bipartisan, whatever you want to call them. I think in this particular instance, we've got an area where it's probably primarily Republicans that are against us because those western states typically have more Republicans than they do Democrats. It's regional, And we also have Democrats against us too. So it's nonpartisan in the measurement of people against us and the people that are with us in that regard. But I think they do look at a bill, and if you have a bill, let's say, with 320 co-sponsors or whatever, and you only have 50 Republicans or 100 Republicans, it looks more partisan. I think at any juncture, if you're where you at least have even 1/3 of one party and 2/3 of another, that's still considered bipartisan or maybe nonpartisan, depending on the issue. But in dealing with what you're talking about, climate change, it's definitely been a partisan issue. I do think, though, that there are more and more people from the other side coming to the table on that. They've started some new climate caucuses, and while they may not agree between the Republicans and Democrats on a lot of the policies, I think more and more people are coming around and wanting to get to the place where they can come up with a solution that they can agree on. But as far as identifying something with climate change, I don't know that. I think it's good for us to tie the wild horses to climate change with Democrats. It's not good for us to do it with Republicans. Is the best way I would say it. So when you're thinking about the message you send in, I would send in a different message to a Democratic office than I would a Republican office. And I send out, we have these things called mail merges, where it's just a mass email that goes out to people but looks like a personalized email, and we use a system called BGov. And I almost always, if not 9 times out of 10, write a completely different email to the Republican members than I do the Democrat members, because it may be just what I was talking about, the dog meat thing. I would write one different to this guy than I would the other guy. So, yep.
Yeah, Marty, thanks. This has been so helpful, and I think I have, my question's a follow-on to this one. And the dog meat thing, I'm gonna admit I was really appalled to hear that story about leveraging Congress members' racism to get a bill passed. I don't even know where to put that because it's deeply upsetting. And I worry, look around this room, this is a predominantly white movement. From your point of view, what is the work that this movement needs to do to avoid linking?
Well,
So those kinds of, the idea that we may throw vulnerable people under the bus to make their lives more dangerous and difficult to get a bill passed feels deeply disturbing to me. What is it we need to do to avoid that kind of strategy that I think isn't how, when we talk about vulnerable people, vulnerable horses, they're all this sort of categorized in our culture as detainable, disposable life, and I don't want to put them at odds. I don't want to I feel deeply disturbed about that, and so how do we not do that as wild horse advocates?
Well, I think, it depends on the issue. In that particular instance, that was probably the only way to get it passed. Like it, hate it, love it, whatever. I totally understand what you're saying. But more broadly, you're right. You look around the room, and it's the same if you talk about the constituency as a whole in animal advocacy. I actually am on an advisory council for George Washington University, and we had an entire 3-hour discussion about exactly what you're talking about. And it's not the animal movement, it's the nonprofit space. It's even very difficult to find employees that are minority employees, because those people have, in many instances, worked their tail off and brought themselves out of something most people probably would have a tough time doing it, and they have tremendous debt from going to college and getting a PhD or whatever the case may be, so they can't afford to take a nonprofit job. They've got to go find a job that pays money. And most of the people that work in the nonprofit space are typically, Caucasian, and I think it's for the reason, or at least in part that reason. And when I asked the folks, 20 or 30 people from other nonprofits, major corporations about this, on the corporate side, it wasn't really an issue. They are very mindful of it. They have just as many people that, are applying who may be Hispanic, who may be African American, who may be Caucasian, whatever the case may be. But I think because of finances, that's been the big problem overall in the nonprofit space, according to what most of those folks said. Yep.
Can you just, sorry Linda.
That's okay.
Can you just touch base really quick? I receive messages all the time from advocates, asking me how they should contact their congressperson. So they don't know what to say, and they're a little bit intimidated. Can you just share with the room that they're just people too? The people that they're calling and talking to, and also how they should word their requests or their letters or their comments that they're making in a mature and professional manner?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this applies to the meetings you guys may have today or tomorrow whenever you're talking to your members of Congress, and I wanted to talk about that some, so I'll try to incorporate these two together. And tell me when I'm getting close to time being up, because I don't want to...
You have about maybe 10
at least 10,
minutes.
12 minutes.
Okay. So to your question, when you're talking about what you're going to say to a member of Congress and what you're going to write in, of course it's easier to write in because you're just sending in a message, but when you call them, I think it's very, very important that you know the subject matter. 9 times out of 10, when you get a congressional staff or even a member of Congress, they're not going to know near as much as you do, as we've seen. And that is an issue in itself, but there are some times where you call and the person does know a lot, and if you don't sound like you know what you're talking about, then they kind of brush you off or blow you off and that sort of thing. So I think it's very important to know your subject matter, have the right resources in front of you, have the documents prepared, printed out in front of you. In the digital world we live in, have the websites pulled up at least on your screen, whether it's Western Watershed's website with information and data about the land, or our website, or the American Wild Horse Campaign's website about the actual wild horse aspects of this. But I think it's very important to have those resources in front of you. And even if you're just repeating something you're reading, it's fine. It's totally fine. These kids, and I say kids, the average age of the people that work on Capitol Hill, at least when I worked there, and probably still today, is like 25 to 28 years old. So, they're just like us. They're coming up in the world. They are dealing with probably what they call issue areas, and within issue areas there could be thousands of issues, but typically dealing with the issues related to 3 or 4 different committees, because you have a ledge staff of the 8 people that you may have in Washington, D.C. in a typical House office at least. You probably have 4 that are the legislative staff. You have the legislative assistant, the legislative correspondent, the legislative director, and then you have like a staff assistant who might handle, just a smaller issue area, but they all have like 3 or 4 different committees, and brevity is very important as well. If you have a meeting, never go over 30 minutes unless it's like, 4 staff members from 4 different offices with 10 people or something like that. But if you're anywhere around 2 or 3 people and you're dealing with one office, whether it's a phone meeting, a Zoom meeting, or in-person meeting, never go over 30 minutes. And I promise you, they are set to go 30 minutes, and that is their schedule. That is what they follow. That is what they typically go by. I try to always even send them a calendar invite just to, make sure. And sometimes if let's say I'm dealing with a committee staff, I might talk a little bit longer with them and get in the weeds and even send them an invite for 45 minutes, just so they know ahead of time, that's what we're dealing with. But brevity is very important for the most part. Be very concise in your talking points and what you're saying. Hit the high notes. You can't take for granted that they understand what you're talking about. I was thinking about this today earlier with Congressman Cohen, and that we were talking about cattle ranchers, we were talking about livestock, and at somewhere somebody mentioned climate change, I think. And I actually thought we should have gone further into that with him, but we didn't have the time. But you can always think about, well, there's this, he's a big big person, like helping with climate change. So that's why I was saying that. But you can't, cover every base. So you just have to be able to streamline things And as I said, be concise, be brief, and remember that you're talking to somebody 9 times out of 10 who's very young. Eric? Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're giving advice to grassroots people who are gonna be calling their congressperson, the average age of the LAs and the LCs might be 26. The average age of the people at the front desk are probably gonna be more like 22.
Yeah.
And these poor kids get just raked over the coals by all the constituents. And remember, these kids don't have any actual influence over the decision the congressperson makes. So don't chew their head off. It's not their fault. Understand that they are the messenger, and be nice and polite to them. And if you want to be firm in what you want them to convey to the member of Congress, then you can express your disappointment. But, you know, I mean, these guys and gals get yelled at, and they get, you know, kind of cursed at, and they get raked over the coals, and that's not effective. I mean, that, you know, it just doesn't work. And so that's just a little piece of advice if you're going to do the actual phone call.
Absolutely, and also remember that these guys are making $20,000 or $25,000 or $30,000 a year in Washington D.C. That's like, I mean, $15,000 or $20,000 everywhere else. It's barely anything. We have one more question.
I just wanted to say also, being polite to these people goes a really long way, because if we're doing this and trying to build relationships with these staffers, being polite, treating them with respect, and also ask them if they know anything about it.
Educating
And
them.
if this is your first time, tell them, this is my first time I've ever been in to talk to somebody. They will help you. They're not the enemy, but you have to treat them with respect.
And you're teaching them,
Yeah.
because they're growing up, and they
Yeah.
might be the next.
And stay on topic.
Yeah.
Don't get off topic. Don't move into, even if you care about cancer or starving children or oil or whatever, don't bring that into the conversation when you set up a meeting about wild horses or whatever the case may be.
Watch for the rabbit holes.
Yes, yes, definitely. If you want to talk to them about that, set up another meeting and have another call. And it's probably a different person that handles the issue anyway. So, one more. Yep.
Just a quick question. I've always been in the veterinary pharmaceutical field. Horses were many years considered companion animals. Is this something that was changed recently, and was that by the livestock?
They're defined by the law as livestock for the most part. Even when we passed the PAWS Act, Pet and Women's Safety Act, we had a little bit of a war with the American Horse Council because it was a bill to provide grant funding to abused and battered spouses where they could take their pets with them, and they went ballistic because we were including horses, and the language said companion animals, and we had to clarify the language to say, yes, they can take their horses, but no, they're not companion animals. And it goes back to, I mean, there are 3 or 4 different instances where various laws mention this on the books, and it has, I guess, you know, sort of changed over time, but that's all, you know, the ag and livestock.
Well,
is
and
what
they're
it is.
defined as an agricultural product, which means that you can get all sorts of tax breaks and
That's
things like
yeah.
that, so that's.
There's monetary reasons for it.
Yeah. Definitely. Is that good?
Yep.
Let me give everybody a break.
Okay, thank you, Marty.
Thank you, guys. I'm glad that I'll be around with you and Mark. If you have any other questions too.
Good.
Marty.
Looks like to me.
Marty, do you want to enter?